All right, it sounds like we have a decent number of people in, so let's make a start. Welcome everyone to this seminar from the Strategic Partnership for Implementation of the Paris Agreement, supported by Melbourne Climate Futures from the University of Melbourne and the European Commission and GIZ, who are funding this. And just because it's a new year, and just to remind you what SPEEP is about, it's essentially an arrangement between Europe and a range of different countries to kind of build networks to support stronger action around climate change. And so we're kind of really trying to encourage interchange between Europe and in this case, Australia, and also to kind of deepen the internal networks. And we've really had a seminar series that's kind of ranged across a whole range of the aspects of the problem, from the physical through the kind of biological and political. And now we're going to have a closer look at social science, because it's clear that one of the barriers that is blocking significant action on climate change is a range of sort of cultural and political factors, particularly around how climate change is understood. And therefore, it's very important for us to think about how it's communicated. So today we have a seminar from Nic Badullovich from Australian National University, from the Crawford School of Public Policy, and from Lyndon Ashcroft from the University of Melbourne, a lecturer in the School of Geography, Earth and Atmospheric Sciences, in both science and science communication. So a climatologist, but also working very strongly on the areas of climate communication. I think the format Nick's going to lead off, and then Lyndon will run a Q&A. And so I'll hand over to Lyndon to introduce Nick.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and thanks everybody for coming today. I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on where I am today, which is the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. We think about communication, and there's some incredible examples of thousands and thousands of years of communication being passed down through traditional custodian knowledge. So I want to pay my respects to the first scientists, the elders past, present and emerging, and any First Nations people who might be joining us here today. I'm so lucky that Nick is starting us off today. When Peter came to me and said, "Oh, we should do something about climate communication. Can you talk about it?" I teach climate science and I teach science communication, but I don't do a lot of climate change communication research. And I thought, I don't have anything interesting to say, but you know who does have something interesting to say is Nic Badullovich. So Nick is doing a PhD, as Peter said, at the ANU Crawford School for Public Policy, and I think he's due to finish later this year. I won't ruin his story because I'm sure he has a lot of tales to tell today, but his road to where he is now, the position that he believes is a place to make real change, has come about through lots of different decisions through his education and his career. So Nick's going to talk for about half an hour, and then as I've got the microphone, I might ask a couple of questions, and then I will open it to you to ask questions as well. So please pop any questions that you have in the Q&A section throughout Nick's presentation, or you can save them to the end. And I look forward to hearing your story, Nick. So please tell us how communication is going to solve the climate crisis.
Thanks so much, Lyndon. That's such a nice introduction. I appreciate that a lot. I'm just going to share some slides so that you can all see. And I'm assuming that can be seen, but if you can't see the slides, please just unmute and tell me. But yeah, thank you so much, Lyndon and Peter. Was all good, Lyndon? I assume the mute was a...
Yep, you're all good.
Thanks. A huge thanks to you, Lyndon and Peter, and everybody here in University of Melbourne and Climate Energy College for having me along today, because it really is a privilege to be able to talk in this seminar series, and to be able to talk about some of the research that I've been doing in my PhD. Before I get started, I also want to acknowledge the traditional owners in the lands in which I'm coming to you from today, the Ngunnawal people, and I pay my respects to the elders past and present, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander peoples in the audience today. So big thanks again for having me along. As Lyndon said, I kind of have a bit of a journey through my education, starting out in sort of earth sciences and doing some climate science stuff myself, and eventually moving into the social sciences, becoming interested in how people conceptualize climate change and also science in general. And so you can probably tell that that's been the inspiration for my talk today, and hoping to share with you some what I call climate change social science, and with a focus on communication. So my talk today is going to be broken up into three main parts. I sort of want to start with the early communication of climate change. I don't want to go too deep into that, but I kind of want to find a starting point so that we can start to tell this story of climate communication. And then I want to step into a little bit of the social science. So like Peter said, it's really great that we can have these conversations about climate change from all these different perspectives. And today, obviously, being social science. And I want to really dive into some of that social complexity that surrounds climate change and how we can start to unpack that. And then finally, hopefully wrap up with some messages around what we can actually do in terms of communication, what the social sciences sort of taught us and how we can implement that to improve the ways in which we talk about climate change. So, and then throughout the talk as well, I'm sort of going to have four main take-home messages, which I'll highlight as we go, and then we'll recap them at the end. And I really look forward to any questions or discussions or conversations. And so be sure to write those down or pop them into the Q&A, and hopefully we'll get to those. So I just want to start in part one, alarm bells and deficits. So I want to start back in 1988, where Dr. James Hansen from NASA gave evidence to the US Senate about global warming. Some of you may have read about this or seen this. I actually wasn't around when this happened, but read about it. And some people argue that this was one of the kind of first public alarm bells, I guess, of the impact of global warming, particularly in Western countries anyway. The scientific debate and scientific evidence and knowledge had been accumulating in the decades before. And indeed, there's like editorials from certain science journals that date back decades before this. But it was at this point that climate scientists were realizing that this is a problem, something that we need to be talking about and getting out into the public sphere and not just being in the academic and scientific sphere. Around the same time, about 3 years earlier, the Royal Society in the United Kingdom released a report. The Royal Society is the UK's National Academy of Sciences, and it has a lot of prolific members to it from the past and also in the present, people like Isaac Newton and Dorothy Hodgkin and Charles Darwin. And the Royal Society was a bit concerned this time in 1985 because they were wanting to know how much science people were actually consuming in their lives. And they were concerned that people weren't getting enough. So this report that they put together essentially argues that science is a really critical component for people to understand, to be able to appreciate the things they have in their lives, to be able to make better decisions, to be able to form the right kinds of attitudes. This is a sort of lining the reasoning that was used. And they had a bunch of recommendations in this report. I just want to highlight one of them. And this was the last recommendation in bold as well. And I'll just read it out to you. It says, but our most direct and urgent message must be to the scientists themselves. Learn to communicate with the public, be willing to do so, and consider it your duty to do so. So there's a lot in that message. It's a pretty heavy message, and we could actually unpack that a bit at the end, because I think there's a lot there. But the point here is that the Royal Society was saying two things in this recommendation. The first being that communication is an essential component, that it's important for people's lives. We're going to dive a little bit deeper into that later on in the talk and try and understand if that is the case. But then the second thing they were talking about is that there's a responsibility from scientists. Now, again, we could have discussions around whether we think that's reasonable or not, and maybe we will at the end. But if we put these two sort of separate events together, we have the Royal Society talking about people needing more science in their lives so that they can make better decisions, so that they can support public policy that's good for everybody. If we combine that with climate change is a problem, and that was being communicated now by James Hansen and people in the public sphere, we put that together and we get something called the information deficit model of communication. And this model is focused around communication, around information sitting with scientists, in this case, experts, and that information is transmitted to people. That information is then helping to fill cognitive gaps. So this is what the theory says, that the people in the public have a lack of understanding of certain parts of science, and if we fill those cognitive gaps, then they'll make better decisions. They will form opinions that match with science. Now, this is something that we can all think about, whether this makes sense or not. And definitely in the academic literature, this model of communication has been critiqued quite a lot for being a little bit too simplistic. So we know that information doesn't just flow from experts, and we know that scientists, not just experts, but scientists in general, don't have all the knowledge. There are traditional forms of knowledge. There are many different kinds of knowledge. So this model has been critiqued as being a bit limited. It's also the model with which climate change has been communicated a lot in the decades following those events in the 1980s. So it's been a common way to talk about climate change, and we still see it today. But before I move on, I want to make one point about the deficit model of communication. So like I said, it's been critiqued as being limited in ways of communicating scientific issues, not just climate change. But my first take-home message relates to this deficit model. I just want to make the point that deficit communication has its place in communication. So this idea of giving people information, in this case, particularly climate change information, and hoping that it can build up their understanding so that they can make different kinds of decisions, it definitely has a role. And sometimes I read arguments from people that say this is no good, we need to throw it away, we need to do something else. I don't think the throwing away approach is necessarily that helpful. I think it's more helpful to work out when we can use things like the deficit model, when it's appropriate, and when we need to use other forms of communication. But we can also ask the question in regards to climate change. So it's been quite a couple of decades since James Hansen gave that first kind of alarm bell. We can ask the question, if climate change has been communicated using this deficit model quite commonly, has it had any kind of effect? We can look to public opinion to try and get a bit of an idea of that. So this is from the Australia Institute, which is a think tank based here in Canberra. And every year they release a report called the Climate of the Nation. And the Climate of the Nation report tracks climate change attitudes over time. So you can see the blue line at the top represents the percentage of the Australian population that believes climate change is occurring. And so this record dates back to 2012, and you can see there's been a sort of steady increase with a bit of a hump in the middle, up to about 81% last year of people that believe climate change is occurring, and that the amount of people that say it's not occurring or they're unsure is decreasing. So we could look at that, and without doing any sophisticated analysis, might just say, like, perhaps the way we've been communicating about climate change has had some effect. I think that's fairly reasonable to suggest without going any deeper. And so, but that brings me to my next point, that this is something that, even though this figure is showing us that there seems to be quite a lot of consensus on climate change, that climate change is occurring, you would think that naturally leads to productive communication, solving the problem together. But I think all of us embedded within the Australian context would know that it's a bit more complicated than that, right? We still see things like debates about climate change. This is from 2016 on Q&A, where Brian Cox pulled up the graph and said, here's the graph. This is a great example of deficit communication. So trying to argue using the facts and saying, if you just understand these facts, you'll have a better understanding. So we still see debates. We still see climate protests. So this one's from Canberra in 2019. And so there are still things going on. It still seems like we're still being unproductive in some ways, that the IPCC is still releasing reports saying more action needs to be taken. There's still international pressure on Australia saying more action needs to be taken. So this brings me to my second take-home message, which is that with what we're seeing right now, we need to be able to use social science research to start to understand this complexity, because the scientific underpinnings of climate change is born out of science, which is critically important to be able to establish what is going on. But now climate change has transcended out of the scientific academy into the public sphere, where it interacts with people's social lives and it interacts with politics. This is the reality of the issue now. And so what I'm sort of going to try to argue here today is that we need to be using social science research to start to understand what climate change means to people and what it means for communication, so that we can start to be productive in our conversations and we can start to work together to find solutions. So that was the first part. Now we're going to step into a bit of this social complexity. It's a bit of a deep dive into this, so hopefully stick with me. We're going to talk a bit about some of the factors that I think are interesting when it comes to social attitudes towards climate change. And I want to start with one that relates back to the deficit model, so knowledge. So remember, the deficit model was about giving the knowledge, giving the understanding to people, and they will build up their understanding, and then they will come to the right sort of conclusions. Well, knowledge is not necessarily that clear cut when it comes to climate change attitudes. And Dan Kahan is a big proponent of something called cultural cognition theory. And this theory essentially says that people don't just use their factual knowledge when they come up with opinions or attitudes or how that influences their behavior. They use social cues, they use norms, they use identities and things to help form those attitudes. And it's not just simply based on how much they know. And so Kahan and colleagues wanted to actually test this. And so what they did is first of all, gave a prediction based on what they called the science comprehension thesis. Let's think of that like the deficit model. What it essentially means is that this theory, the SCT theory, predicts that people with lower levels of scientific literacy should exhibit lower perceived risk of climate change. And then as people gain more science literacy, they should show higher levels of perceived risk of climate change. This is what SCT predicts. But what Kahan and colleagues showed in their research was that the relationship between those two is actually the other way. So it suggests that people that gain more science literacy actually tend to have a lower risk perception of climate change. So something's going on here. To complicate this further, this problem has been worked on even more than it has just in 2012. And so the effect of knowledge on climate change risk perceptions is actually a really active area of research right now. Here's another 2 articles of research that look at this. So these 2 articles, I don't have the time to go into the details, but the point I want to make here is that knowledge itself seemed not to be too much of an indicator of someone's risk perception. But further research would suggest that there are different kinds of knowledge that you can measure. Knowledge about the causes of climate change or knowledge about the impacts and responses. And some of this research suggests that it's the knowledge about causes of climate change that's really important for developing risk perception, for developing the idea that climate change poses a risk to health, poses a risk to security. So it matters what you're trying to measure in terms of knowledge. So I'm trying to just show here that knowledge itself is actually an area of debate at the moment as to what does knowledge actually mean and how does it affect risk perception. The other thing is that what Kahan and found in their study was that as people gained more scientific knowledge, they observed this phenomenon called polarization. People became polarized. And what that means, particularly in the context of climate change and climate attitudes, is that people's attitudes diverge. So it just represents a difference. If there was a particular issue that we all agreed on, we all have a similar opinion, then that's fine. But if we start to disagree, then people start to move further apart. Hornsey and colleagues were interested in this political polarization, and they wanted to understand whether that political polarization correlates with climate change skepticism. And so what they did, you can see all of the countries on the graph on the right. I want to highlight one of them at the bottom, the United States of America. What they found was that people with right-leaning political ideology tended to correlate with climate change skepticism compared with people on the political left. The other thing I want to show you here is that Australia is also on this figure. And you'll see that Australia is actually quite close to the US. This demonstrates that Australia also exhibits this correlation between right-wing political ideology and climate change skepticism. This is not to say that this is the case for every single person, but this is what some of the aggregate research shows, that there seems to be a relationship here. Just for another comparison, if you look just above the United States, you'll see the United Kingdom is almost at 0. If a value sits at 0, then that means there's no correlation. It means that people on the left don't necessarily think that much different to people on the right when it comes to climate change skepticism. And there are some reasons for that. The UK is much less polarized in terms of political polarization than Australia and the US. To step a little bit further now into the now, this is some research from Colvin and Yotso, and they looked at data from the 2019 federal election. And they asked a question to people how important climate change was to you. And like the public opinion that I showed you at the beginning from the Australia Institute, it was pretty high. People said that climate change was an important issue. But as they dug a little bit deeper, they actually broke apart that response based on the people that were answering that and their preference towards their political parties. And they found that people typically on, again, the political left, Greens and Labor voters, tended to see climate change as the most important issue or an important issue. And people on the political right tended to see it as not very important, not at all important, or did not consider. So what this is demonstrating, the main point here is that we have divergence, we have polarization. And we could ask the question then, why is that a problem? Why is political polarization or any kind of polarization in terms of these issues a problem? It's an issue because in order for us to come to solutions, in order for there to be effective public policy, we need to have agreement. So if we are disagreeing on how to solve the problem or the existence of the problem, then it becomes very hard to work collectively, to work together, because ultimately that's the pathway that we need to take, because climate change is such a problem in the whole system of the earth that there is not just one solution that's going to fix things. We need to be able to work together to do this. So political polarization represents a barrier, represents a difficulty in being able to get people to work together. And it also represents a difficulty in terms of communicating about the issue, because you can see how much people's views diverge. That's all I want to say now on the political polarization of the knowledge. I want to move to a third complex factor as part of this social complexity section. And I want to talk about uncertainty. So uncertainty is a really interesting one. Like Lyndon said at the start, I've had this journey and I've started out in science and now ended up in social science. And I have this perspective of uncertainty from sort of both areas, from like within the scientific academy and then sort of within the public sphere. And definitely within science, uncertainty is a way to show your confidence. It's a way to show this is the value that I'm showing you, and I'm confident that that's the value within plus or minus 1 or 2 with a 95% confidence, something like that. That's a way to demonstrate scientific credibility, because you're being open and you're being comprehensive with your statistics to show that. But the word uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as it does outside of the scientific academy. Uncertainty sometimes has negative connotations, like if you're uncertain about something, then you definitely can't be sure about it. So therefore, why should I listen to you? So uncertainty is one of those tricky terms. And Howe and colleagues wanted to try and understand this. So they conducted an experiment, and they wanted to give people, they took US participants and they broke them up into a few groups, and they gave them different uncertainty messages. One of those messages was something like this: climate change will cause between 1 to 7 feet of sea level rise in the next 100 years. They called this a fully bounded uncertainty message because it contained both the lower limit, the 1 foot, and the upper limit, the 7 feet of sea level rise. Again, this is a US audience, US participants. So they gave them a fully bounded uncertainty message. And after the participants read that, they then answered some questions on a survey. One of those questions was about trust in scientists. And what they found was that people that read this message reported a higher trust in scientists. That in turn led to a greater acceptance of the message. So it seems like this fully bounded uncertainty message was actually quite effective. There was another group that they wanted to test and compare. This group received the fully bounded uncertainty message that we see here again, but they combined it with a second message, which they called irreducible uncertainty. And what this message said was sea level rise will cause more extreme weather events. It's called irreducible because you can't make it more precise than it already is. You can't boil it down any further. It says that more bad things are going to happen, and that's it. So fully bounded uncertainty with the irreducible uncertainty message. And they then asked the participants, a different group of participants, the same questions. And they found trust in scientists went down. And it also meant that the message acceptance also went down. So what's going on here? This is obviously fairly new research from 2019, but what the authors suggested could be happening here is that the irreducible uncertainty message could have too many negative connotations. And there's other research to suggest that when messages are too dire, they're too negative, it can have a kind of paralyzing effect, and it can induce a feeling of helplessness. And that doesn't necessarily help people feel like that they could do anything about it. There's this uncertainty messaging is also another active area of research. And so another study here by Gustafsson and Rice also looked at uncertainty. They did a review of the literature around uncertainty messaging. And they found that there are definitely different kinds of uncertainty messages, and they can have different kinds of effects. So the point here is that talking about something as what I would suggest is, from a scientific perspective, uncertainty is fairly clear, fairly open in what it tries to convey, is actually a very difficult thing to communicate. So think back to the beginning when I talked about the Royal Society saying that it's the job of scientists to communicate. Scientists have to speak in certain ways for the certain audiences and people that they're interacting with. And when something like this shows up, that uncertainty is difficult to communicate, that poses difficulties. So it's something that we need to understand. And it kind of leads to why my second point about having to use social science to really understand what's going on here. I then get to my third take-home message. So after looking at some of that social complexity, a lot of that research that I showed you has implications for communicating, how we communicate. Obviously, the first one, thinking about knowledge. Is knowledge important? In some cases, it might be. Some forms of knowledge might be. Thinking about uncertainty messages and political polarization are important to consider. So these have implications for communication, and we need to understand them if we're going to be able to build more cooperation. And now the final part. So I've given you some research, we've sort of dived into that. And the final part of this, I want to talk about what can we take from that? How can we use that insight to be more practical with communication? How can we use it to improve the ways in which we talk about climate change? And the first thing I want to talk about is values. Values are super important. So values are like these guiding principles that we all have and we all use. And people have varying different kinds of values. There are heaps of them. Some of the values sit sort of at the surface of us, so they're easily movable. It might be that you have a particular preference for one brand over another, but then that can be changed and swapped out, whereas there are much deeper values in our core that are much more immovable, much harder to change. This is an excerpt from a report by McLaughlin and colleagues from Climate Outreach, which is a wonderful charity in the United Kingdom, which does a lot of research around climate change and engagement, but they also do a lot of public-facing engagement, where they work with different kinds of communities, people on the political left, people on the political right, older folks, younger folks, many different kinds of groups. And so they do a lot of practical work, and they put a lot of this stuff into practice. That's why I like this report, which was about mainstreaming low carbon lifestyles, because they gave an annotated example of how to incorporate values into the messaging. So you can see this says here, the climate is now changing around us. The responsible thing to do is ask how we can protect ourselves against these risks and stay in control. And so they highlight here that responsibility is actually a value. So you're tapping into a value that typically people from the center right have. Not everybody, but again, this is sort of general lessons. And so incorporating values into our communication is really important, because we only have to think of our own experience when we've talked to people who may not share the values that we share. It can be quite uncomfortable sometimes. We may want to retreat from those instances of interaction. So this is something really important to consider. The second important thing is social identity. And social identity comes out of psychology, and essentially what it is the concept of ourselves that we take from our group membership. So when I say group membership, I don't mean physically like paying someone for membership or a group. I mean the groups that we put ourselves into psychologically. So they can be physical. They could be like a group that you have at work. Like you could have a team at work, and then you all share a collective social identity because you're part of that team. They can also be sort of more conceptual identities, where, for example, you might value playing vinyl records, and that might form part of your identity. And what's the social identity approach in psychology tells us, and what the research shows, is that when we perceive people to have a similar identity to us, we consider them an in-group member, somebody that's similar to us in terms of their identity, versus people who don't share a similar identity to us, we kind of perceive as an out-group. And this has really important implications for communication. It has important implications for how we interact with each other. And I want to show you an example of an experiment by Fielding et al. From University of Queensland. They wanted to actually test some of this social identity within the context of environmental communication. And so what they did was they took US participants and they broke them up, mixed them up and broke them up into 4 different groups. And they gave each group a message about nuclear energy policy. You can see at the top 2, I've put them in a red border because 2 of those groups received the message and it was framed in terms of a certain set of values that corresponded with sort of right-leaning political ideology, which in the US typically means Republican values. The lower 2 are in a blue border because they were framed in terms of more Democrat left-leaning values. So they were interested in first knowing the content of the message, just framing the message in terms of certain in-group values matter or not. But they combined it with something else which was an endorsement. Each message for each of these groups came with an endorsement. So the red tick represents a message that at the end of it, it said something like, Republicans endorse this message. Whereas for the groups that showed the blue tick, when they finished reading this nuclear energy policy excerpt, theirs came with something along the lines of Democrats support this. So what the researchers were trying to do was then analyze, does the source of the message matter? Does it matter if it's coming from Republicans or Democrats, or does the message itself only matter? What they find is that the source of the message does seem to matter, that Democrats tended to be more receptive to the message, to take more behavioral actions towards supporting this nuclear energy policy if it came from Democrats. And the same is true for Republicans if it came from Republicans. So what we're trying to highlight here is that the in-group messenger mattered. So this is obviously, again, a active area of research, and I'm not trying to say this is the unequivocal answer to the problem, but what this suggests is that social identity actually matters when we're talking about and communicating about climate change. That if you're, say, an out group and you go into a particular community of people and they don't see the messenger as one of them, then you might not be as influential in terms of your communication. So that's a really important lesson, I think. And again, it's a developing area of research. The third point I want to make is around climate change discussion. So this is one which is a little bit contentious, I think, because some people will say, and I've definitely read, for example, on Twitter, that there's no point talking about climate change with people if they're not going to listen to you or they don't want to talk to you. Matt Goldberg from Yale with some colleagues did a bit of work on this, looking at the importance of discussion. They found that people that were discussing global warming with friends and family actually led to a greater acceptance of the climate change consensus, of climate change science. And the increase in that acceptance then lead to them wanting to have more conversation. And so this set up what they call a positive feedback loop. Lyndon will be able to tell us all about feedback loops because the climate is full of them. They're also in social science. So having conversations about, in this case, global warming was important for setting up that social feedback loop. So having conversations with people is actually really important. And there's plenty of other research, particularly from fields like deliberative democracy, where people get together and they have a facilitator and they have very different viewpoints and they start to discuss and share ideas. They can be really productive for coming together to get shared understandings and achieve shared goals. Linked to discussion is the fourth point I'm going to make, which is around outcomes. So remember, this section's about what can we do. I think one of the really important things is to think about the long-term outcomes. This comes from some research that I was doing in my PhD, where I was interviewing climate change communication practitioners. And I'll just read this quote out to you. I was asking them about outcomes, and I asked, what do you expect when you communicate? What do you hope is going to happen? And in my mind, I wasn't too sure what to expect. I thought maybe there would be specific sort of measurable outcomes that want to be measured immediately, but this is what the participants said. The outcomes of climate change communication can be apparently nothing. But if what you've done is got people together to think about doing things differently and brought together cohorts of people who previously weren't engaged with each other, you actually do build social capital anyway for the next campaign. And what this said to me was that it matters when we think about the long term and the cumulative effect that communication can have. There's a lot of research that talks about strategic communication, finding the right frame, for example, to give to the right audience to hope to get an outcome. But then that research is very much critiqued because effects don't necessarily last that long for people. So if we're thinking only on the short term, then we might not get much change. And this is particularly important for discussion, because if you chat with someone about climate change, and I know I definitely have, sometimes it can be a bit awkward and you want to kind of retreat from the conversation, and you can walk away from that thinking, wow, that didn't go well. You know, this person still thinks what they think. That's totally okay, because if you step back and look at the longer term, you can see that having those conversations actually matters for how we form our opinions. And being able to have those conversations again and again means that we can always come back to them with new insight. We can always come back to them with something else. And we can always learn something about who we're talking about and then incorporate that into how we talk about climate change, again, to make it more collegial. That brings me to my fourth take-home message, which is that discussion is important, and to remember the cumulative effect of that discussion can have and in general communication. I just want to recap now the take-home message. We finished all the three parts. Thank you so much for hanging around. I've been looking at the participant numbers and we've stayed, I think, the same at what we started. So that's fantastic. Kudos to you all. So recapping the take-home messages, the first one in part one was about talking about the deficit model of communication. My point there was to say that that's an important way to communicate. It's an important way in certain situations. And there's definitely research to suggest giving people knowledge about climate change is important. But obviously we need to do a little bit more in understanding exactly how important that is. The next point was that we need to do that social science research to understand that complexity, to be able to say something about how climate change interacts with people's lives and how we can improve communication. And then finally, that communication is a key process to working together. And it's a key process that occurs at many different levels of decision-making and also in everyday life. I want to leave you just with one other thing, which came out of the research that I was doing with climate change communication practitioners, because I've said here that discussion is important. And I asked them about who these practitioners of climate change communication research, who they thought should be doing the communication. Because if you think back to the beginning, I showed that the Royal Society said that scientists should be communicating. So I had in my mind, maybe practitioners would tell me scientists, but they answered that question almost all in the same way. And the answer that they got to was everybody. And I thought that was really interesting, that they say that climate change communication isn't just for the scientists to do. It isn't just for the experts to do. It's not just for the academics. It's not just for the professionals. It's for everybody. So this is part of breaking down those barriers, that climate change doesn't have to be a difficult conversation to have. There are ways in which we can build up our understanding and our communication techniques to be able to improve those. And I just want to quickly show a reference slide. So if you're looking back on the recording, you can pause that and look to any of those references that I used in the talk. We've come sort of full circle, and I just want to thank a few thank yous again to Lyndon and University of Melbourne Climate Energy College for having me. I want to thank my supervisor, Beck Colvin, and my panel, and also that I'm supported by Australian Government Research Training Program Scholarship and also an ANU ICEDS PhD Supplementary Scholarship. Again, thanks so much for having me, and I'm really keen to hear your questions, and I see we've already got some. So thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much, Nick. I almost, my heart jumped a little bit when you said everybody. I couldn't agree with you more that the time for waiting for someone else to have those conversations is well and truly past. Everybody needs to be having conversations now, whether you're not certain, whether you've heard something that somebody else can maybe correct. I wholeheartedly agree. And it's really interesting to hear that your research has found that. I was wondering, as we wait for a couple more questions to come through, whether you can tell us a little bit more about what your PhD is about and how it's going as you track towards your completion.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, my PhD has kind of ended up being a bit of a mix of different techniques, because as I say, I was generally interested in, this field or developing field of climate change communication. It kind of borrows from a lot of things. So in that talk, obviously, I talked a bit about psychology. I talked a bit about media and things. And there's a lot of fields that kind of do research on this. And so I was sort of hard pressed to find specific projects that I wanted to do. So I kind of tried to mix it up, and I focused my research kind of on something that I didn't actually talk about in this talk, which is framing theory, how we actually frame climate change messages. And that is also a really active and mixed area of research, and it's really fascinating. And so I've done some interviews with practitioners, and I'm actually in the process of trying to do a bit of experimental work myself with testing different kinds of frames and climate change communication frames. And also done a little bit of sort of kind of gathering review work to try and work out what things we still need to do in terms of research. And so tracking hopefully to finishing my PhD this year. Let's hope.
All the best. I can see we've got lots of questions coming through, but I just want to, if I could just sneak in one more before I start reading out the questions. And if anybody would prefer to ask a question verbally, please feel free to raise your hand using the raise hand function, and we can give you the microphone. The idea about the deficit model being useful in some situations, I wonder if there are some people listening in who might have spat out their beer when they heard that, as the deficit model is a bit of a dirty word in the communication space. Is that a resurging idea, or something that you get a bit of pushback on when you bring it up?
Well, I mean, it's something that I've thought about, I guess. And I definitely, when I was introduced to this field, it's definitely something that we get taught, I guess, that, this deficit model is a bit of a bad thing. It doesn't capture a lot of stuff. But I mean, I think that's definitely true. But I think a lot of different approaches can be limited in some way. And I think part of the knowledge research, looking at whether knowledge is important, for example, in risk perception, highlights that, knowledge can be important. And so when I think of the deficit model, I think of there are going to be some groups of people that are going to be very receptive to just facts and knowledge. And I kind of sometimes put myself in that boat as well. Like, I'm very happy to listen to climate scientists, yourself and any other folks in talking about, and I want to try and take that on and try and incorporate that into my thinking as well. So my kind of perspective that I've developed through my research is trying to have an inclusive one, and so that I don't throw things away unnecessarily because they don't resonate with me or I don't like them. I try to take a bit of a more like, we can use this in a certain context and let's understand what that context is. That's kind of the perspective that I've been developing, I think. But you're absolutely right, and it's totally okay to disagree. It's the wonders of research.
It's just been a while since I've heard someone say, "Oh, it's okay to just tell someone something that they didn't know."
Yeah.
All right, so we've got lots of questions. I'll start with Kate, who was quick off the mark and asked about whether your research has looked at the impact of lived experience of climate impacts in terms of people's relationship to attitudes and responses.
That's a really good question. So my research itself hasn't looked at people's lived experiences and how that influence attitudes, but there definitely is some research, and there are some people that I know at ANU who are just starting some PhDs sort of on this topic and trying to understand how people's experience influence their attitudes. I can think of a book by George Marshall, who actually is one of the co-founders of Climate Outreach, so the UK charity that I talked about. And he wrote a book, and he kind of started to talk about how people's perception or people's experiences of extreme events in the US and how that influenced their risk perception. And he talked about some research that essentially said that people who suffered sort of hurricanes in the US, some of them ended up being more sure that climate change wasn't happening because they considered that event to be so rare that they weren't going to see it again, and it wasn't going to happen to them again. So they became sort of less concerned. And so it's, again, a complex area to look at. And yeah, I haven't looked at it in my research, so I can't give any really nuanced details, but it's a really good question. And I think, as I say, there are some people that are sort of doing some of this work now, which I think is fascinating.
A question from David that a few other people would like to hear your comments on. And actually, you can probably speak to it quite well, given what your topic of your thesis is. Your view on specific framing of how we talk about climate change, this idea of the climate emergency, I guess Extinction Rebellion might also be something that, I'm interested in your views on that too.
Yeah, thank you everybody for that question. So my supervisor's probably going to be like, you gave a talk and you didn't even talk about framing. And so it's like, it is something that I work on predominantly in my PhD. It's something I've thought about, read about, written about. So frames are really important, I think. Frames are ways in which we, encapsulate certain parts of issues. And so we can talk about climate change, in terms of being an emergency. We can talk about climate change in terms of being a public health issue, a national security issue. Part of the first part of my PhD was actually trying to collect all of the frames in the academic literature and work out which were the most common. And the most common was sort of scientific frames, economic frames, as well as environmental frames. Public health frames are becoming more popular, but there are a bunch of different kinds of frames, like framing climate change in terms of spirituality or in terms of religion, saying that there is like Christian stewardship, for example. There's been some research, particularly on how that frame is able to speak to certain groups, particular religious groups. So the framing literature is really diverse. So it's hard to give a full rundown, but I can definitely say that in terms of the experimental work that's gone on, understanding which frame is more effective for which particular group of people, those insights can be a bit mixed, mainly because it's hard to kind of do standard experiments where the experiment done by this group of people is the same as this group. It can be hard to compare, but some general lessons, like things like public health, have shown to be important in being able to make people feel hopeful sometimes, but there's also other research which suggests that maybe it doesn't. So I guess getting back to kind of first principles in communication, thinking about audiences, or the word that I like to use is sort of publics. So people who you're sort of communicating with, or who's communicating with you. I didn't give much of an answer on the framing because there's just so much to say, but if anybody has some other specific questions, very happy to chat to that, or you can also send me an email and we can chat more and open up the box of framing.
Thanks, Nic. That's really generous. All right, Alan, I can see you've written a question in the Q&A, but you also have your hand up. So maybe we could unmute your microphone and you can ask your question verbally if you'd prefer.
Okay, thank you, Lyndon. And thanks, Nic. You're a great communicator. I just wanted to pick up on your point about deliberative democracy. If we're going to get any sort of bottom-up action on climate change, a lot of it's going to happen at local government level. And I'm wondering, how do you believe a citizens' assembly, let's call it that, might be resourced? What sort of inputs are needed to get such a group sort of singing from the same hymn sheet?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Alan, and thank you for noting communication in my talk. So yeah, that is a good question. And things like citizens' assemblies, they've also been studied, I guess, in academic literature, and particularly in different contexts, like the UK. There's quite a lot of climate citizens' assemblies where people are sort of getting together, representing different views and viewpoints in the community, and they can reach, like I say, really good agreement on things like climate change and local action. But your question as to how that would be resourced, I mean, I suppose it depends, because again, if we look at kind of, I suppose, policy on climate change, that tends to be stronger, definitely at the local and state levels. So that could be something that comes from there. But definitely deliberative approaches are really valuable, but yeah, they can be intensive on resources, because yeah, you do need good facilitators, and you need to have a diverse range of views to be able to communicate, and then you need to get the experts in to be able to give that information. So it's a good question. I don't necessarily have a clear answer to it, but I totally agree that it's something that's really important to do.
Just when you have a wide divergence of stakeholders, which is the whole point of a citizens' assembly, how do you communicate to a group like that with the intention of finishing up with consensus?
Yeah. So there's a bit of research which incorporates two things that I really like. So one is the deliberative democracy and one's framing. There's some research which talked about how to use framing in deliberative democracy. And they found that when you have these citizens' assemblies and you give, like, let's say, climate change information to citizens and groups, stakeholders, it pays to have lots of different frames. So it pays to show very diverse framed communication of climate change instead of being narrow. And so that is an approach that suggests that is more effective in being able to get people to consensus. Whereas if you only show one side of the story, or you only use one particular frame, that can resonate with certain values, which means some people may feel left out of the conversation. And so by being diverse in the ways in which we represent climate change, particularly in those citizens' assemblies, has been shown to potentially be a way to make more people feel included and to be able to reach things like consensus in those situations.
Thanks, Nic.
Thanks, Alan.
All right, there are two questions that I'm going to combine now, cheekily, because we've got so many. I knew this would happen. I thought I'll be able to ask lots of questions, but everybody else obviously has lots of questions too. Jeremy and James are both interested in disinformation or misinformation, whether that is Sky News, filling that gap in the deficit model, maybe not what we need, or how climate misinformation is affecting the pace of change, particularly in Australia. I'm wondering whether do you have any ideas based on your research and what you've presented about how we can counter that, or whether that is needed now?
Yeah, so great question. Thanks for asking it. So mis and disinformation, so they are really important and slightly different things. So one sort of has more of an intent, the disinformation intent to cause harm, versus misinformation can be sort of sharing things sort of unknowingly or causing that. I haven't done much of that research in my PhD, but I've definitely seen, I know some people that do. So again, if you're keen to know more, do feel free to reach out and I can put you in touch with these people. But what I've seen is that there are people like one of the researchers I cited in my presentation, Sander van der Linden, who talks about inoculation theory. So this is like an approach of giving people certain kinds of information about like scientific consensus and stuff, to making them less susceptible to mis and disinformation. And there's also John Cook as well in Australia, who has also done research on this as well. So looking at how you can kind of, and inoculate in the sense of kind of like a vaccination. So giving people a bit of immunity to misinformation. Apparently, like from what I see, and again, this is not my area, but from what I see, it seems like the important approach in terms of combating that is through prevention. But there are definitely some researchers that look at the effects of correcting misinformation. And I think both can be important, but I do see a lot of inoculation theory. So again, if that's something you're interested in, if you just search inoculation theory, I'm sure you'll see van der Linden pop up on Google. But I hope that gave some answer.
It's a difficult situation, isn't it? Because that also, the us versus them, that polarity increases a lot when you consider the Sky News viewers or people who are really indoctrinated in the misinformation. And the inoculation theory is something that really interests me as well. So I'll be definitely checking that out. Thanks again. Okay, here we go. Simon is asking a question about identity politics. Whether there's another question that asks people to ask themselves why they vote for one party, to find out if these people can self-reflect. And I think that kind of relates also to a question from Sarah, getting people, what happens to people when you talk to them about climate change, what that does to their social identity, whether it shifts it or whether it changes the content of their social identity and their social group. I know those two questions are different, but I think they also address a similar thing. What aspect of this communication, this conversation idea, gets people to self-reflect, and then what the result of that is? Can you speak to that at all?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And so I think something that I've noticed, particularly in the academic literature through my searching and reading, is that when it comes to sort of the communication relevant research, a lot of that research typically is what I would call kind of that one-way strategic. So it's like giving people messages and seeing how they respond. Definitely the situations where you're able to interact with participants and ask them questions about how they, if they're reflecting on these kinds of topics, is something that's probably not done as much. And it's something that I was hoping to sort of do in my research, but definitely like in the context, I can say of framing, there's a particular study which looked at that kind of reflection and said, because the whole idea in framing theory is that if you frame the communication in a certain way, you can shift some kind of attitude. And they found that inducing reflection, or they call frame reflection, where people actually knew that the information was being framed, had some kind of effect. And so in terms of getting people to reflect on their identity, I mean, it sounds like a very interesting idea, something that I haven't necessarily come across. But I mean, I think that also speaks to this practice of sort of reflexivity, being able to reflect on what we think, what we value, what our identities are, and being willing to kind of adjust those as needed. So that, I think that kind of is part of a condition for having good conversations, because essentially if we go into our conversations always being so hard in our views and wanting to only force someone to move theirs, then it can be difficult to adapt, because obviously conversations are much more complex communication environments than like lab settings where this stuff is typically tested. So it's a hard one to necessarily measure, but I mean, I think reflexivity is maybe part of that process of reflection and being able to change.
Yeah, okay. We've got time for 2 questions. Thanks, Simon, for moving your question from the chat to the Q&A. This is a bit of a curveball, but maybe I'll be interested to hear your thoughts, whether you've given any consideration to the communicative agency of the non-human world. We're not the only actors in this crisis, and it's only going to get more obvious and louder. Given that we can't solve the crisis and we must now live with it, planetary changes will be a powerful voice. What do you think of the communication in that way?
So just so I get the question right, so using communication that doesn't just focus on puts humans at the center, looks more at nature. Is that sort of the question?
Simon, if you want to take we'll just get your microphone off mute quickly so you can clarify if you like. I see your hand is up. Ooh, I'm not sure if Angela is, oh, there we go. Okay, you're free to go.
Okay, right. Thank you so much. If we're talking about, it's a very good presentation, by the way, I really appreciate it. If we're talking about communication, what I'm suggesting and proposing, which Bruno Latour also talks about, is that we're not the only agents in the world in terms of communication. The planet itself is mutating or going through a discontinuity. So the climate or the planetary crisis will itself drive identity and changes in the world, which we won't be able to control. And that itself will change the types. It is a communicative voice. So we're not just a static environment trying to get as many, like a standard political environment, trying to get as many people onto the right side as to the wrong side. And I wonder if you give any thought to the way that interacts with our attempts to convince people. So I've got inverted commas here, you can't see it, but inverted commas, convince people of the truth, when in fact the planet is a very powerful actor.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. So it's a really fascinating question. I think, so yeah, it's probably something I haven't given too much thought to, but I can think of something that I think is related. So when you were saying, talking about the fact that the Earth, it does change, and that then affects the ways in which we talk about or communicate about climate change, I think that's a really important point. So perhaps the answer is yes, that the changes that we see are having some kind of effect on the ways in which we're going to be communicating, because you're right. The kind of lessons that we see is that by sticking to the same messages, sticking to the same techniques is not necessarily the most effective way. And all we have to do, I guess, is look at, for example, like social media. Maybe 20 years ago, the most effective way to be able to communicate about these ideas, or perhaps in newspapers or certain kinds of writing, but nowadays it's online. Nowadays it's through TikTok, Snapchat. There are different kinds of ways to communicate. And so I think I probably haven't answered your questions directly, but I think part of that is saying that yes, as the Earth goes through changes, that then affects the ways in which what we need to communicate about. And then probably another example of that is thinking about, well, are we past the point of communicating about the reality of climate change and now at the point of communicating about the solutions, or communicating about courses of action, or communicating about other specific avenues? So sorry if I didn't give a very specific answer to that, but I think that's a really fascinating question.
Yeah, thanks, Simon. And we might move on in the interest of time. I'm going to squeeze in one last question, which is actually going to be two questions combined, but I think it's nice to maybe if we can finish on sort of some practical things. I know we have practitioners, scientists, communicators, academics in the audience. Dave is asking about finding the key words that connect to different audiences. And someone else was also asking about the key inclusions. If you were to make a one-pager for our local government or for an audience, what are the key inclusions for times when we need to provide a very brief piece of information? I know that's a big question to ask, trying to write something small takes the longest a lot of the time, but What do you think, Nic, in terms of the key messages? If someone was to walk away, you've given us your 4 key messages in your presentation, but if someone was to have to write a business card or a piece of information about climate change to share with people, what do you think are the key things they should include?
That's a great question. I think it's a great exam question too. That would be an interesting one. Get it all on one page. So thanks for the question. So sort of thinking on the fly, because there are so many important things. I'd love to write a thesis. I'm writing a thesis about it. Yeah, it's I think something important first up is with sort of all good communication. I was thinking about this today as I was walking around. I thought that part of being effective in your communication, right, is like knowing audiences. That's like a communication golden rule, I guess, knowing your audience, or in this case, knowing publics, the groups of people. And so then I thought to myself, how do you get to know that? How do you know that? Do you look at demographics? Do you look at public polling? One way to obviously look at that is by listening. So I think one of the first sort of messages I think that I would put on there is that if people are engaging in any kind of conversation or communication about climate change, listening is a really important point to probably do first, because that allows you to kind of understand what's lying underneath that person's communication. So like I said, values can be really embedded in the ways we talk about climate change. Social identities can be really embedded in that as well. And so by understanding that comes from first sort of listening to what people have to say. The other thing is, I think the whole long-term outcome situation is really important. So I kind of, as I say, when I read literature, I kind of get the feeling that people are trying to find the silver bullet. They're trying to find what is that one thing we can do that's going to fix the problem. And unfortunately, I don't think there is one, in the same way that there's no silver bullet for climate change now. It's such a systems problem that we can, obviously there are really critically important things like emissions reduction, which probably sits at the top of the priority list, but there are so many other problems that start to arise that we need to address. And so I think the long term, instead of thinking in terms of what's the one thing I can do, it's more like, what's the sort of cumulative things I can do? What are the steps I can sort of take either every day or every week or something that can help to build up a bigger picture of what's going on? So I think if I just limit it to 2, I think listening is really important, particularly. So in brackets, conversation, talking about it's really important. And then thinking about what those conversations and communications can add up to over time. And obviously, one of the insights from the interviews that I conducted, like I said, that the responsibility is not just on scientists to do this, that everybody can do this. And that's a really important point, I think.
Thank you. I think that's a lovely place to leave. Many thanks to everybody for sticking around. I know we've run a few minutes over time. And for those of you who questions we didn't get to, unfortunately, Nic, would you be happy for people to contact you if they want to follow up?
Absolutely.
We can keep their questions as well. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, everybody, for attending. I think, so this is the first seminar in the Climate Energy College Joint Seminar Series, and this final slide will show you that this is the first of a lot of other things that are happening in February. There are a lot of other seminars and roundtable events that are happening throughout the month. So we've got one next week looking about urban greening and climate change, and then there are a few other events coming on as well. So if you follow the links that are in the chat, you can learn all about what's happening so far in 2022, another really important year for climate science and climate action. So thank you so much for joining us. A big thanks again to Nic for sharing his knowledge today, and we look forward to talking to you soon.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for having me. It's been really great.